Hello and welcome to my long promised characters and attribute guide. I've made a couple changes. If you've heard me talking about this before, I was planning to put a lot more data into this, but as the beta draws on, not everything's complete. So I thought it would be better rather than giving very specific data, specifically in the video guide, to stick to more general things so that this a guide is a little bit more useful going forward. However, to make up for that, I'm going to be including in this video a link to the text guide, which will be updated a bit more frequently since it's easier to update a text guide. And I also have um, a link for the spreadsheet where I've been gathering all the data on these different abilities, and a link for the forum topic where all these things are posted. So yes, the data here is going to be more general, but if you're coming into this guide and you're like, oh man, this guide was made like a year ago, it's probably outdated. Hopefully, if I've been keeping up with it, you can go into the description and find a lot more relevant information that's going to follow the same general format as this guide, but be in text and be more frequently updated. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. So we'll be starting off today talking about attributes, what the value of the different attributes are, what kind of builds you would want them on, and what ages you would need to maximize these different attributes. So the first attribute we're going to go over is the attribute points, which you might think, oh well, attribute points don't we get a constant number? Actually, no. For each race, there's going to be a different value for attribute points. You can see right now I'm looking at a Tendrimine. He's got 490 attributes. Let's say I want to play an Ohgmir instead. 438 attribute points. So that's the low and the high end of the spectrum, and there's a bunch of other races in between. So attribute points are in themselves something that you have to worry about. Now, for an Ogmir, Ogmirs has very like specialist abilities. They're very good at doing one thing specifically. So like attribute points don't really, or the lack of attribute points doesn't really hurt them that badly for the type of builds you're supposed to use for an Ogmir. But say you want to do a human instead, the Tendrimine, well then you're looking at more like less specialist, more generalist builds. So for instance, the Tendermine is going to be very good at a hybrid, which is a mage slash melee build. I call them battle mages as well. Um, or a mage might be good at a psi fighter, which is a fighter that has high psyche for magic resistance. So it's a magic resistance fighter. So those more generalist builds and less specialist builds really appreciate that attribute points. That being said, more attribute points doesn't hurt any builds. You should always look at a lack of attribute points as a downside, but it's going to hurt some builds more than others. Um, the next attribute that I'd like to go over is size. Size is actually your character's height. So as you increase size, your character gets taller. As you decrease size, your character gets shorter. Um, there's about 5% damage bonus that you'll see if you play around with size. So like 5 to 6% more damage bonus generally between maximum size and minimum size. So that's the biggest difference that would make you say, I want a max size character. Is if you're a melee character, you may very well want a max size character to just get the absolute most out of your melee damage. Um, then another thing to consider is the idea of health. There's really not much health. It's about 1 point of health for every 5 size, but it does affect it a little bit. And then I found, depending on the build, you're going to get 1 to 2 more carry weight. So all these things are affected by size. Size is generally around a 20-point investment, depending on whether you want to minimize it or maximize it. So it's a much lower investment than all the other skills as well. Um, so like, the smaller damage bonus may not sound that impressive, but when you consider it alongside the fact that like, strength may give a lot more damage bonus but needs a lot more points, it's actually pretty good. Strength is the next thing we're going to move on to. Strength is your ability to do damage with pretty much any physical attack. The first point of strength is that your weapon is going to have a strength value. I don't care if it's a bow, I don't care if it's a dagger, a spear, two-handed hammer, they're all going to have a strength value. And some of them are going to have a pretty low strength value, and some of them are going to have a pretty high strength value. But whatever weapon you're using, it's going to have a strength value. So if you're using a weapon that's above your strength value, say that you've got a 95 strength weapon and you're at like 90 strength, you're going to drain stamina really quickly to the point that it's just not good to use a weapon that way. Um, and then conversely, if you have it below your strength rating, it actually is going to lower stamina from even the non-penalized stamina you have for having the appropriate strength. It actually lowers it even further. So you can get, if you're like 20, 30 strength above what you need to wield your weapon, you're going to have very low stamina drain on that weapon. Um, the other thing that I would throw in with that is that bows, if you're a good bow crafter, you can very much specialize the strength of a draw weight of a bow to the strength of the character. So a good bow crafter is going to make it so that you can always, by adding an extra point or two of strength, get more bow damage. So it's very important to archers for that reason. Um, Now, as we were talking about with the size, there's also damage bonus. Damage bonus does not apply to ranged attacks. It does apply to melee, though. So it makes strength a very, very good stat for melee characters because not only do you need it to wield your weapon, but also your weapon is just going to straight do more damage the more strength you have. And like I said, it's about a 30-point difference between absolute max or minimum strength, which is 10 strength, to absolute maximum strength. It brings your damage bonus up very considerably if you max out strength on a high strength character. Um, the other things it does, it has a carry weight effect. The carry weight effect is the strongest carry weight effect in the game. It's about twice as strong as Constitution, which also gives carry weight. Um, then it has a armor weight effect, which makes it so that you can wear heavier armor with less penalties. And that is going to go the opposite way. Constitution does about twice as much as Strength does, but Strength still helps with that. Um, Finally, there is stamina. You get about half as much stamina from strength as constitution, and the same amount that you get from dexterity. Um, Strength caps out at age 30, and it also caps out at stout level fatness. So if you adjust your character's weight up to around 120, 130 or so, you're considered stout, and that's going to give you a bonus to your overall strength. So the next stat we're going to talk about is dexterity. Dexterity is basically the speed stat. It increases movement speed more than anything else. Um, and to put it in perspective, though, because movement speed is such an important stat, it's a very highly valuable stat, but they've changed it a lot between how it works in Mortal Online 2 and how it used to work in Mortal Online 1. So in Mortal Online 2, there is a much higher minimum speed than there was in the old game. If you have 10 dexterity, which is the minimum once you actually get into game, you're going to move at about 345 in a combat sprint, which is the fastest movement pace on foot. Um, However, if you max that up on a max speed Alvarin, which is elves, they're the fastest race in the game, you can get all the way up to 442 speed, and then with the Alvarin gifts, you can bring that up even further to 447. So the difference is between 345 and 447. So it's not, like a 10 speed character is super slow and can't move at all. That being said, most foot fighters are not going to run 345. You're not going to see many people running around with minimum dex unless it's a dismounted cavalry build. You should expect to be facing opponents who are about 415 in speed, which that's about what a stout dwarf would be. And a stout dwarf is a good foot fighter build, so you will see some people running around at that speed, but you can see the difference between 415 and 447, which is the absolute maximum speed build, is much lower than the 345 that you would barely ever see. Um, Dexterity, also like strength and constitution, gives stamina. It gives it at the same value as strength, half the value of constitution. Um, Finally, there's something called a weak spot, which is when you're shooting somebody with a bow or you're attacking them with a melee weapon. You might just have a weak spot in the combat logs, which means your attack just completely ignored their armor. So if you're fighting really heavily armored builds, this is a really good thing to have proc. That being said, weak spots are very, very random, and they're not a really reliable thing to build your character around. You will get more weak spots if you increase your dexterity, but I consider that more of a bonus to increasing dexterity than a reason you would want to decrease the dexterity or increase the dexterity itself. Because if you build around the weak spot chances, they're not going to proc enough to really do that much for you. It's more mainly the speed that you would be going for with a stand or a dexterity build. Um, Dexterity is going to cap out at around 23 years of age. It actually has the same value in between 18 and 23, but there's no real positive benefits to being 18 over 23. So that's why I say 23 is where it caps. The other thing is that if you are skinny, that's going to cap your dexterity. Skinny gives a bonus of plus 10 to dexterity. Um, Constitution is the next stat we're going to talk about. Constitution is your health stat, basically. It's, you've seen a similar stat in basically every other MMO. It raises your health by 1 point for each point you assign to it. It's also going to give you a lot of or a stamina, as we were mentioning earlier, about twice the value of strength or dexterity per point. Um, it raises carry weight at half the value of strength, and then it's also going to give more armor at about twice the value of strength. Constitution is capped out at 23 years old, just like dexterity, except unlike being skinny, you want to be either fit or stout for Constitution. This is because there are no Constitution bonuses from weight, but there are Constitution penalties. So fit or stout are the weights you can go without receiving a penalty. All right, next on our list is intelligence. Um, And intelligence, I've made some handy graphs, so I'll paste one in here so you guys can look at it. However, I would like to keep in mind that intelligence is a stat that's being workshopped by the developers. We mentioned that there's no benefit to damage between 50 and 100 to the developers, and they have expressed a desire to change that. So we will be seeing that recurved. I thought it was going to be this patch. It didn't end up being this patch. So look for that in the future. But the developers are working on intelligence, so that curve is going to change, and that'll be updated in my text guides. Um, Also, intelligence gives 1 point of mana per point of intelligence. And it's something worth keeping in mind that your max mana is also your mana regeneration. I did some testing and determined that for every 5 mana that you raise your mana pool, you get 1 mana per 30 seconds of regeneration, and that's your base regeneration for every build. So if you want both a high pool and good regen, you want stats that increase intelligence. Um, Intelligence caps out at 60 years old and obese. Um, Psyche is much like intelligence in that it's a mana stat. It gives 1 mana per psyche, just like intelligence. However, instead of being the magic damage stat, it is the magic resist stat. So putting points into psyche is going to make you more resistant to magic damage from other players, or anything else that does magic damage. So I'll paste the psyche graph in here as well so that you can look at that and get an idea. It's worth keeping in mind that you can see it raises the minimum damage, the maximum damage, the chance and the chance of resist, which all generally lead to a lower damage received by your character. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and we're going to move on to humans. humans as a race. So humans are characterized stat-wise by the fact that they are a high attribute pool race overall, with a couple exceptions, and I'll get into those. Um, but overall, they have the highest attribute pool of any race, with Tendermeans and Sardukans as especially being the highest attribute pool races in the game. Um, they're pretty mixed in terms of what they're good at. For instance, Callards are very strong and heavy constitution, while a Sardukan is very weak and has higher mental stats such as psyche. So there's a lot of variety in terms of what they're good at. In general, though, I would say they're about the second fastest race, um, behind Alvarins, which are the fastest race. So they have several notable clade gifts that I'd like to mention that make their race better. One reduces the mana regen penalty for armor. So if you're wearing, say, 5 weight armor and you have that particular gift, it'll treat it as 3 weight armor. It's always 2 lower than the actual weight of the armor you have, which positively affects mana regen. The second thing that I'd like to point out is that there is a gift for friendly fire. Humans do less friendly fire and they receive less friendly fire. So if you are a human with this gift and your guildie stabs you in the back on accident, it's going to do half the damage that it would have otherwise. And if you accidentally stab your guildie while swinging at an enemy, it's going to do half the damage to him. Now, these are not cumulative; they do not stack, which means, if you're a human, your buddy is a human, and um, you both have this gift, and you stab him, it's not going to do 25% damage. It only applies that bonus once, so it's going to do 50% damage. Um, Other notable effects is that humans can instantly purge an ability or a debuff on themselves and get debuff immunity for 10 seconds afterwards. So if you pop that ability and you're, say, corrupted or something, it'll remove the corrupt, and then for 10 seconds after, if they hit you with another corrupt, it's just going to piff right off and do nothing. Um, Humans also get a war cry that increases the resistance to magic, though this isn't working very well at the moment. And I believe they get like one other magic resist buff. So let's talk about the different races of humans. So the first race is Callards. Callards are very large. They are physically strong. They're based off of real life Vikings. Um, they have the highest strength of any human. They have the highest constitution of any human. Their dexterity is all right. It's not great, but it's not terrible. Um, they do not have very good intelligence, and their psyche is all right. So the reason you would play a Callard is if you want to be a foot fighter. They're very large. You pump up that strength, you pump up that size, and they're going to do awesome melee damage. They also can be a good archer because of that really high strength value. Um, they're not going to be a very good kiter archer, but they could fight off opponents in melee and then switch to archery at a range if they need to. And they're going to do quite good damage. They could also potentially be a good heavy mounted archer. I say heavy because there's going to be penalties to size on mounted builds, but they could ride a very large horse and be a pretty decent mounted archer. Um, so Callards have the second fewest attribute points of any human, but I feel like the bonuses they get, especially if you're going for some kind of melee build, really justify that trade-off. Curites are the next one I want to talk about. They're also a fighter race. They have the highest speed of any human by virtue of having the highest dex. They have slightly lower strength, size, and constitution than a Callard does. So they're basically a fast fighter. That being said, they have an abysmally low attribute points. You can see right here, 446. The Ohgmir were 438, so they're like 8 points higher. That's really bad. Um, this is the one I have the strongest opinions about in the current balance. I believe that this race is entirely useless. Some people are going to disagree with me on this one, but I'm going to give my justifications why and let you draw your own conclusion. The reason I say that they are entirely useless is because of the dex normalization. Um, if we pump them up to absolute maximum dexterity, they're not going to move that much faster than the other races. Meanwhile, they've got the lowest attribute point total, and they're missing multiple stats that are really good for foot fighters that the Callards have, while also having slightly higher attribute bonus. Um, so they're bad at hybrids because they don't have the attribute points to do it. They're bad at foot fighters because they're worse in every single regard except for a Callard, and they're definitely not good mages because they don't have exceptionally good intelligence or psyche. So I just don't see why you would ever play one. Next is the Sardukans. The Sardukans are based on real life, like Arabic or Persian people, I believe. Um, the Sardukans are a very good mage race. They have, first off, they have the highest attribute total in the game, though they're tied with Tindermeans in that regard. Um, and then they have very good intelligence, and they have exceptionally good psyche. They've also got pretty decent dexterity and constitution, so they're very much a race worth considering if you want to make a mage. Um, or potentially like mixing them in with other races such as the Sidoyan. Um, so they're pretty good mages, and that's the main thing I'd think they're good at. Though I could also see mixing them a little bit into some hybrid builds, keeping in mind their strength is the lowest of all humans for strength, so it does hurt your melee damage a lot to have Sardukan, especially since they're also the smallest human race tied with Kirites for that status. And the next race that I want to talk about is the Sidoyans. The Sidoyans seem to be based on sub Saharan Africans. Um, they have a very high strength. They're actually not that large in terms of stature, but they have very good strength, and then they also have the highest intelligence of any of the human races. So if you pump up their intelligence, they're just slightly behind dwarves in overall intelligence. So if you really like the human bonuses, and you want a mage that has very high intelligence but also has human bonuses, for instance, the ability to purge corrupt from yourself so that you don't have to use mana and a spell cast to go straight into healing yourself, Sidoyans can be an excellent race for mages. Um, like I said, they're good mixed with Sardukans or completely by themselves. I could also see them being very useful in terms of a mounted hybrid or a mounted build that uses both melee and magic because of that combination of a really high strength and a really high constitution, or not, a really high intelligence. They also have high constitution though, so that's another good bonus. Um, so that's the uses that I would see for them. I'm not a huge fan of them on foot because of their low dexterity. But though, like I said, you're only going to move so slow on foot. But I feel like they're a little bit slow with a little bit low of an attribute point total that I would actually want to play them as a foot hybrid. Um, the next race is the Tendermeans. The Tendermeans are based on the Romans. Um, they are tied for Sardukans with the highest attribute total, and they're really most comparable to Sardukans because of that. They've got a higher strength and a lower constitution than the Sardukans. They've actually got a very good intelligence, but their psyche is a little bit lower than the Sardukans. Because of this, I feel like Tindermeans, a pure-blooded Tindermean, is just an excellent hybrid. It's got a balance of good intelligence and good strength, but I feel like they're also pretty good for, say, if you have a Callard build and you want a few more attribute points on that because you want to get your Psyche up or something. If you're trying to get some more attribute points into a build based on another race, it's also really good to mix Tendermean in there if you want that high strength, while Sardukan's better for mixing into like mage builds like the Sadoyan Sardukan I mentioned. All right, so moving on from the human clade, let's talk about the Alvarins. The Alvarins are the fastest race in the game. They can get all the way up to 130 dex, and so that is The 447 speed build that I was talking about as an Alvarin. Because of the fact that they are so absolutely fast, I think they're the one race that I feel like Dex isn't entirely overrated on them because they are the absolute fastest. And they've got a lot of really good bonuses that kind of feed into this. First off, they can move or jump at full height while in combat mode. Well, usually when you switch to combat mode, your jump is reduced a little bit. They can fall off a cliff and take half the damage, which makes them really good at like going through rough terrain, especially if people are chasing them. They can jump off a cliff to get away that might kill the people pursuing them. They use less stamina and can breathe longer while swimming, so they can, cross a river or jump into the ocean. And then they also just get their straight buff to movement speed, as I was talking earlier. That's the only way beyond Dex that you can raise movement speed. And then they have a bonus where when they're using bows, they can use a bow that's 20 strength higher than their effective strength. So say the max strength Alvarin is 89 strength. Um, that means that if you use that gift on a max strength Alvarin, you actually can use a 109 strength bow effectively. And that's very good for their kiting abilities. They can kite and they can shoot very well, making them one of the best foot archer races, in my opinion. Um, Among the Clarins, you have two different clades. There's the Vila. The Vila are slightly stronger, slightly faster. And then they've got less total attribute points and slightly lower intelligence. So they're a bit less good at mages, but if you're doing any kind of physical heavy build, they're an excellent choice. For the Shivra, they're more based off of like the Drow. You can see with like that highly black skin, and they tend to have higher attribute totals and then higher intelligence. So they're very good for dex mages, mages that kite and cast. Um, but they're not as good at the physical builds as the Vila. All right, so next we're going to talk about Ohgmir. Ohgmir are basically dwarves. They're the strongest, they're the most intelligent, and they're the highest constitution. But as I mentioned earlier, they have the lowest attribute points. So you might hear that they're the highest strength and the highest, intelligence, and think they might be a good hybrid. But because of their lower attribute totals, they actually tend to be very good at specialist builds and really bad at generalist builds. So you're going to play like an Ohgmir fighter or an Ohgmir mage, but definitely probably not a hybrid. Um, so, that being said, their notable clade gifts include the ability to smoke Ichor for a powerful self heal, and this temporarily reduces their maximum health. So, you can pop this ability that gives you quite a powerful heal in the middle of combat, but then you're going to get reduced maximum combat until you eat some food or rest to make that go away. So, you can't just keep popping it for forever, or else you're going to just absolutely destroy your maximum health. Um, the second bonus is that they have multiple bonuses for decreasing the drawbacks of heavy armor. I do not believe that this applies to mana at all, but this does apply to maximum movement speed for sure, and I believe it's going to apply to stamina regen as well. Um, They also have damage reduction while standing still, so basically they're just a supremely tanky race. They also, them and the Alvarin both get an ability that makes them see better at night. So far that's been pretty limited in use, but I hear it's getting buffed, so that should be a little bit better. Blaine are the first type. They're slightly larger with a higher constitution. They're considered very good tanks, very good foot fighters. Um, they're not as good at the magic, though they still are pretty good at magic. They're just objectively worse than the Hrugar are at it. Um, so you'd mainly play one of these if you wanted to play a foot fighter, or potentially like a melee cav build. Um, the Hrugar are the second type. They have more strength, more intelligence, a little bit less constitution, a little bit lower size. Um, so the Hrugar would be very good for light cav builds if you're going for a lower weight. so that you can ride without encumbering your mount as much. Um, they're also very good for foot fighter as well, though I feel like the Blaine's a little bit better. And then they're just objectively better at being a mage. Um, they have very high intelligence, the highest intelligence cap in the game. So a full 60-year-old obese Hrugar can just absolutely level people with their spells. Thursars are half Rhizar, half human. Rhizar essentially being orcs. So these are half orcs in traditional fantasy lingo. Um, their riser half makes them larger, stronger, more dexterous. In most cases, I believe it actually decreases their speed on a curite, and higher constitution while lowering their intelligence, psyche, and attribute total. Um, they're basically giant in your face melee damage builds. They're fairly tanky, though not as tanky as an Ohgmir, but then they also just have ridiculously high damage bonuses, and their clade buffs feed into that. Their clade buffs being a health steal, um, a passive regeneration that gives less magical healing, um, passively reduced physical damage at the cost of more mana or magic damage. And then that ability is actually both a passive and an active. And if you activate it, it gives you reduced magic damage at the cost of more physical damage, meaning, if you're going up against a mage and you want to just close in there and beat them up and you don't have people beating on you in melee, it's a really good idea to pop that ability temporarily so that you can go do that. And then they also have multiple damage buffs, including their war cry, which buffs the damage of everybody around them. There's really two viable ways to take this build. In my opinion, the first is the Thursar Callard. So the Thursar Callard is the largest, the tallest, the strongest. It's basically everything about a Thursar um, taken to the extreme. The disadvantage is that you're actually going to need your clade gifts even to just fully max your physical attributes. Um, Without clade gifts, you can't even fully max constitution or whatever you're going to put the points into last. Once you get your clade gifts, you can fully max every physical attribute and get a little bit of psyche, but basically no psyche, so you're incredibly weak to spells on that build. And that's why I believe the second type is viable is the Callard Tendermine. The Callard Tendermine is in all physical stats objectively worse, but they have a higher attribute total, and that higher attribute total is going to leave you with about 50 psyche to put into, or yeah, 50 points to put into psyche, so that you can get your magic resist up and actually like not die immediately when people cast spells on you. So those are your two real viable, or you could go, Callard Tendermine if you want just a little bit of magic resist. The rest are all objectively garbage, in my opinion. The Curite, for the same reason that I don't like Curates as a base race, I don't feel like it's worth it to lose all the stats you lose for being a Callard just for a little bit more dex. The Sardukans and the Sidoyans, while their human counterparts are very viable, they're very viable as mages, which Thursar mages are not a thing. You do not want to be a Thursar mage, so they don't really give you any benefits that positively impact what Thursars do well, which is smashing people's faces in melee. So for those reasons, I say the Callard and the Tendermine are really your two only good choices for the Thursar. Finally, we're going to go over Fatness a little bit. So Fatness isn't just a way that your character looks, it's also has some really big stat benefits. Um, as you get skinnier, you tend to get more dexterous and faster, though that does drop off after a certain point, and being max level skinny or skeletal as it is just all negative. While with fatness, as you go up, when you go up to like the stout range, you actually get some like strength bonuses, and you're pretty strong and buff at that. But once you take it beyond stout, it starts to give physical debuffs, and eventually gives really, really good mental buffs. Plus 20 int and plus 20 psi for being obese, but that's at the cost of minus 30 or minus 30 strength, minus 40 dex, and minus 30 con. So there's definitely some trade-offs there. Um, The other thing to note is that your health goes up and down as your strength goes up and down. Um, and it, as a rule, goes up the entire way with your health going up and down the entire way with your health going down. But it's worth noting that like obese is actually less health than bulging, which is the lighter category than obese. And the reason for that is because the constitution penalties. Once you add them together, there are certain stages where you get less overall health by being fat. But the general rules, it goes up as your health goes up as your weight goes up. And with that, I'd like to conclude the guide. Thank you for watching. I always respond to comments if I can. If you have any questions, and I'm happy to try to address those here or direct you to places that they can be addressed. Um, and then I will be posting in the link the guide to the data that I used to make this, and that should hopefully stay a little bit more up to date than the video guide. It will, I'm sure, being in the middle of a beta, this is going to be out of date eventually, but those text guides should stay up to date as long as I'm actively following this game. Thanks for watching.